Chapter 10. Freedom. Beginning in 1943, the tide of war turned against Germany. The Axis powers were fighting on too many fronts, and the Allies were coming at Hitler's army from every direction: north, south, east, west, and from the air. Did that stop or slow down the mass murder of Jews? No. In just 1 month in 1944, Germans sent 440,000 Jews from Hungary to their deaths. As the Allies approached camps in Poland, the Nazis were determined to hide their crimes from the world. They tried to destroy camps and empty out prisoners. More than 150,000 prisoners were forced to march into Germany, farther away from the Allied troops. Some traveled for miles and miles in bitter cold, without coats, boots, or any protection. Their only water came from falling snow. Thousands died along the way. However, the Nazis did leave some prisoners behind. Russian soldiers found 7,000 inmates at Auschwitz. Though the Germans had destroyed much of the camp, several warehouses still stood. They were filled with prisoners' belongings, hundreds of thousands of men's suits and women's dresses that the Nazis had planned to sell. One warehouse held 14,000 pounds of human hair. Finally free, some prisoners ran to greet the soldiers. Others felt afraid. They didn't want to come out because they didn't know what to expect. As more and more camps were liberated, Allied troops couldn't take in the horror. The sick and starving, the dead bodies stacked up like logs. "Why do humans have to do this to other humans?" one American medic cried out. The last camps were liberated in May 1945. Adolf Hitler was already dead. He'd committed suicide on April 30th. His government had fallen apart. His dream of a Nazi empire lasting 1,000 years was shattered. On May 7th, Germany officially surrendered. The Holocaust was over. Chapter 11. After. Italy had already surrendered to the Allies in 1943, and Japan signed a peace treaty in September 1945. World War II was over. About 55 million people had lost their lives, including civilians, people who weren't soldiers. Top Nazis were brought to trial. They were accused of crimes against humanity. That means murder and other terrible acts directed against the whole population. The first trials were held in Nuremberg, Germany, and lasted until 1949. Nazis faced judges from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Most were found guilty and either hanged or sent to prison. But many Nazis escaped Germany to start new lives in other countries. For decades, Nazi hunters searched for these men and women. Over the years, some were brought to trial. One man, Adolf Eichmann, was caught in Argentina, tried in Israel in 1961, and executed. Adolf Eichmann's job was to carry out the plan for the final solution. Trials continued for decades. In 2016, prison guards and office workers were still facing court charges in Germany for war crimes. These people were in their 90s. One 94-year-old witness, Leon Schwarzbaum, was a survivor of the Holocaust. He told a reporter that punishment wasn't the only reason for a trial. It was to hear the truth. But neither punishment nor the truth could change the past. Millions upon millions of people had been killed. Millions more had been uprooted, forced from their homes and their countries. After the war, people tried to return to countries that had been occupied. Some found their houses destroyed. Others found they weren't wanted. Violence against Jews continued. Where would these displaced persons, DPs, go? The Allied military set up camps in Europe. In a way, the people there were still prisoners. Some lived in these camps for years. Gradually, things were sorted out. Many Jews emigrated to Israel, a new Jewish homeland created in 1948. Some left for the United States and other countries. 5 years after the war, there were only 45,000 Jews left in Poland, down from more than 3 million. Germany, which had started with 500,000 Jewish people, now had 37,000. Austria's 250,000 Jews were reduced to 18,000. For a time, survivors of the Holocaust kept silent. What they had gone through was too painful to talk about. But then they began to speak out. They didn't want people to forget the horror. If people didn't hear about the Holocaust, then history might repeat itself one day. Museums and memorials. Holocaust museums and memorial sites have been built around the world. In the United States, the National United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is in Washington, D.C., but there are many other sites of remembrance from coast to coast. In Germany and Poland, concentration camps have been turned into museums. Survivors are fewer and fewer. Soon all will have died, but their stories must be passed on to future generations. There were some German heroes in the Holocaust. They risked their lives hiding Jews, smuggling them to safety, supporting resistance. Still, as a whole, the German people kept silent. Camp employees, secretaries who worked in Nazi offices, ordinary German citizens. Some who knew what was happening gave the excuse that they were only following orders. But how could they watch and say nothing? Had they agreed with Hitler's ideas about a master race of Aryans? Or were they afraid to speak up in case they would be punished or killed? Yet German soldiers who refused to kill did not receive harsh punishment from military or Nazi leaders. One group of German women protested when their Jewish husbands were rounded up by police and imprisoned. The men were freed and the couples were reunited. Gerda Weissman-Klein spoke out about the Holocaust for decades. After the war, she and her husband moved to upstate New York. She raised a family, wrote books, and worked with schools to teach tolerance. She was awarded the Medal of Freedom in 2011 by President Barack Obama. That is the highest honor a U.S. civilian can receive. Hatred and tyranny are not over, she declared. What if more people had stood up to Hitler and the Nazis? A Protestant minister in Germany admitted to once having been anti-Semitic. His name was Martin Niemöller. He had been a member of the Nazi Party. During the war, however, Niemöller changed. He saw the evil for what it was. He spent 7 years in concentration camps for speaking out against Hitler. In his speeches, Niemöller named groups of people who were taken away while he had remained silent. He included Jews, communists, Catholics, and more. But he always ended with, "Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Genocide. The word genocide was coined during the Holocaust. Its definition is the deliberate killing of people from a particular group. Tragically, the mass killing of Jews by the Nazis is not the only instance of genocide. There have been others in much more recent times. Starting in 2003 in Sudan, a country in northeastern Africa, wild gangs sponsored by the government began slaughtering people who lived in an area called Darfur. Victims were killed because of their race, not their religion, with black Tufari targeted. To date, more than 400,000 people have been killed and 3 million sent into exile.